Hello, everyone. I'm Chandna Singh Nirwan, and I welcome you all to the Stories of the Indian Diaspora series curated under TMYS Review June 2021. We are glad to introduce and bring in conversation Mr. Christopher Raja, an Australian author of Indian origin. Christopher Raja migrated from Kolkata to Melbourne in 1986. He has lived and worked in Alice Springs since 2004. His co-authored play, The First Garden, was performed in botanical gardens throughout Australia. His acclaimed young adult novel, The Burning Elephant, was written under a New York grant awarded by the Literature Board of the Australian Council. Raja has been shortlisted twice for the Northern Territory Writers Centre's Book of the Year award. In 2016, he appeared at the Ubud Writers Festival in Bali, and The Burning Elephant was launched in China at the 9th Annual International Conference of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, Guangzhou. He is currently developing his forthcoming novel, for which he received the Northern Territory Varuna Residency Fellowship and a grant from the Literature Board of the Australia Council in 2017. Raja is the 2021 UTS Copyright Agency New Writers Fellow. I welcome you, Chris.
Hi, Chandana. Thank you. Hi, Antara.
Uh, Joining us in this conversation is Antara Roy Bhattacharjee. She's a young, vibrant writer from India, West Bengal. After completing her master's in English, she has taken up teaching as profession. Writing and singing are her passions. Recipients Poetry to Perceive is her recent published work, a book on poems which has been released across various online platforms like Amazon Kindle, Amazon.in, and Google Play Store. I welcome you, Antara.
Thank you, Chandana. It was a wonderful introduction, and I'm really grateful and thankful to the entire TMYS fraternity for giving me such a wonderful opportunity to interact and converse with such a dignified and scholarly person. And I welcome you, Christopher. Good evening. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to have you with us.
Antara,
Thank you.
now,
Thank you.
now kindly proceed with your questions.
Okay, so Christopher, my first question for you today is, what was the main cause or reason behind migrating from India to Melbourne, Australia in 1986?
So in 1986, I was 11 years old. And so for me, I didn't have much of an understanding as to the main cause of this. Was a decision that my parents made. And as a young boy, I had certain ideas about it, but I didn't really know why. I mean, in many ways, I was sad to leave because I was leaving, my grandmother, my dog, and when you're 11 years old, that's what you think about. You think about your dog, you think about your grandmother, you think about your friends, you think about where you live and your neighbors. So I had mixed feelings, and of course, the other feeling that I had about moving was excitement, because I thought, Australia sounded very exciting. So when you ask what was the main reason, when I think back at that time, the reasons were vague. In hindsight, I think my parents probably wanted different opportunities that they thought that they might have if they left India. It's a bit hard for me to find out because a lot of my work deals with grief and the loss of a parent. So I can't actually ask both my parents about that.
Okay, and so you were 11 years old, right, when you shifted to Melbourne, Australia?
That's right.
Christopher. So, can you just share with us some of your thrilling experiences you had in your teenage years with respect to food, sports, movies, theaters in Melbourne?
Sure. So, on arrival in Melbourne, And I sort of cover some of this in my memoir, and which is called Into the Suburbs, A Migrant Story. And we arrive in Melbourne as a family. I'm an only child, so when I say as a family, I mean my mother and father and myself. And we arrive, and the first thing that we notice is it's very quiet, and there aren't many people there, and compared to Calcutta, and the traffic is very ordered, and we have some relatives here, and the relatives, of course, they look like me, but they're acting different. They act like Australians, so that was quite a surprise. And very quickly, from 11 till 12, I'm busy trying to not be an Indian anymore, and I hit puberty and become a teenager. And now it's just a race to try and fit in and try my best to not draw too much attention on myself, but at the same time, I want the attention, especially of girls, and also I'm trying to modify my behavior, because all of a sudden I'm starting to realize that there are different rules in the playground, for instance. It's not good to be too academic. It's no longer cool to read. And I was a big reader, and all of a sudden it's not cool to read. If you read and you study, you're a nerd. So I was trying to not be a nerd. I was trying to be a cool guy, and whatever that means. And I didn't read during my teenage years. In fact, from being a voracious reader, I stopped reading for maybe 3 to 4 years, much to the frustration and almost horror and disgust at my parents were like horrified at this, because my parents valued education, and so to have a child who wasn't reading and who wasn't doing his homework I think worried my parents a lot. Meanwhile, I did notice that as a teenager, everyone in Australia had things and were always busy accumulating things, whether it was a television or a new runners or new shoes, or 2 cars, or keeping their house looking very nice. I just felt like there was this ongoing materialistic aspect to life, and less of a community. So people were working very hard and not seeing each other. And so I missed, as a teenager, I missed that aspect of family. And even though we have a family here, just catching up regularly as we did in India, there were things that, especially back in the 80s, I mean, I'm talking about, the 80s, 90s here, family was very important to, and continues to be important. So I don't know if it's a cultural thing or a time thing, but yeah. So it became more individualistic as a teenager. Yeah, I became more individualistic.
Okay, that was pretty interesting. Now I would ask Chandana to take over.
Thank you, Antara. Chris, I read in your memoir, Into the Suburbs, A Migrant Story, about the change in your family name from Raja Ratnam to Raja. And a few weeks back, we had Dr. Yadu Singh, a cardiologist from Australia, and he had something very similar to say when he shared that his name went from Yadu Nath Singh to Yadu Singh. So is this only the ease of pronunciation, or do you think there's something more important or significant to it?
Well, you see, I think there is sometimes the ease of pronunciation. But one of the things that I found out, and I found out this was common. I mean, the changing of names in monuments, as we've seen through, Black Lives Matter and various incidents in the last, maybe even through post-colonialism, and whether it's in India, whether it's in Alice Springs, whether it's in Melbourne, we see history being contested. whether it's our own individual history, whether it's our country's history, and whether it's our state's history. And so names are often linked with identity, and so identity is contested, and history is contested. So, of course, in my memoir, I write about an individual personal story, and so I write about how the name got changed from Rajaratnam to Raja, making it easier to pronounce for a Christian priest. But you know, I was writing that informed as a teacher in Australia and various other places where I noticed people would change their names, partly to fit in, just sometimes to make it easier, sometimes to make for job prospects. So there are various reasons why people change names, and of course, whoever controls names and the narrative is generally the one in power. So I think it's an interesting thing to consider why people change their names, and that's why I began my memoir with this topic on names.
All right. I would also like to know about your co-authored play, The First Garden, which is based on Olive Pink's story. And how has the story of a trailblazing Aboriginal activist, Olive Pink, influenced your life that you decided to pen down a play on it?
Sure. So far, you know, so my first attempts at writing started off writing. I was writing short pieces and, you know, publishing short stories and articles. But Natasha, who I co-wrote the play with, was acting and suggested I meet a dramaturg. And of course, at the time, I was also living in Alice Springs near the Botanical Garden. And the Botanical Garden in Alice Springs is named the Olive Pink Botanical Garden. And I was intrigued by this name, Olive Pink, and I wondered why it was called Olive Pink. And I didn't even realize it was a person's name. And I wrote another play, and it got performed, and it did quite well in Alice Springs. And everyone looked at me and said, "Hey, you know, you should write a proper play. You know, you can do a play." And you know, being I guess a little bit naive, which made me extremely ambitious, I said, "Oh, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do just that. I'm going to write a play because I had seen Shakespeare done in the Botanical Garden, you know, Shakespeare in the Park." And I said, you know, I'm going to do a play, but I'm going to do a play differently. I'm going to write a play for the gardens, like Shakespeare. And I did. And it got published, and it ended up being performed in various botanical gardens in Australia. And in the process, I also got to research the life of Olive Pink, whose life was extraordinary. She was a Tasmanian woman who got so incensed at a massacre that she'd read about in 1928-29 of Aboriginal people, the Warlpiri people in Central Australia, that she went out to the desert to see what was going on. And when I researched her life and started looking at her photos and her artwork, in a way, she reminded me of some of the older kind of Australian ladies that would come and visit India, especially Calcutta, when I was growing up. And they would go to places like, you know, Mother Teresa or some of the schools in Calcutta. And it reminded me of that sort of, I mean, Olive Pink wasn't a missionary, but it reminded me of some of those women, maybe like a missionary, but also people with a social justice that would come to countries like India and try and do something. And in a way, I found her quite an intriguing character. And so I started to research her story and got quite involved in the process. And then I found out that it was quite a, you know, there were all these other stories about Australia, hidden stories, you could say, that needed to be told, and that was one of them. And so I'm so glad that I did discover that. Looked into that story and did some research and wrote about it. And yeah, it really took a a big part of my life. And yeah.
Okay, Chris. Also, I would like to ask here that Aboriginal issues in literature and debates are being heard about directly or indirectly. So, how have these impacted your writings, if they have? And do you think Aboriginal themes are still camouflaged in mainstream Australian literature?
Well, you see, I feel, there's something that's a massive question in some regards. I feel for me, you see, I was about 28 years old when I decided to. So I came to Australia when I was 11 and lived in Melbourne. And then at about the age of 28, I decided I was going to go live in the desert in Alice Springs. So when most of my friends were, writers generally don't go to the desert, at least not the writers that you're probably reading about from Australia. They're more likely, most Australian writers that you probably read about in India probably aren't living in places like Alice Springs. They probably, have moved and written in Europe or America. Or they're writing from Sydney or Melbourne. And so the reason why I say that is because I went and lived in the desert. And so I didn't go to America and I didn't go to London to study writing. I went and worked with Aboriginal people in the desert. And what I found was a very low literacy level. And I found it very hot. And I found it very remote. And I found it very challenging. And I lived there for 12 years teaching and working in the desert. And 2 of my children were born there. I have 3 children. And so, that was my life. And I wrote at the same time because that's what I do. So no matter what's going on in my life, I'm writing. And so it wasn't something that I thought, I'm exploring something that needs to be explored. I just wrote what was around me. And like I said earlier, the botanical garden was just literally around the corner from my house. And, my friends, my colleagues, my students were Aboriginal or came from Aboriginal families. Some of them were Indian, some of them were Australian. When I say Australian, I mean, that worked on cattle stations, that were, children of nurses, doctors, lawyers that worked out in communities around Northern Territory. So this was just part of my life. And I tried, so I just picked up things and I started to write about them. And yeah, that's how it worked.
All right. That's quite interesting. Antara, I think you'd like to go ahead with a question.
Yes. So my next question to you, Christopher, is when you were 11, you shifted to Melbourne. So what sort of other barriers you had to face initially, irrespective of language and culture?
Well, one of the, I think, we speak English in India, of course, and but of course there are different. How would I put it? I mean, I'm going to say slang, but that's not exactly the word I'm looking for. Mores, social norms, rules almost, but unsaid rules that were different, and of course, being a teenager, as you asked me about before, there are things like, for me, I mean, when you're a teenager, it's very basic, especially when you're moving in school and it's how do you deal with coeducational schooling. How do you deal with girls and how do you deal with the slang? And so there were words that in slang, for instance, that even though I was, I came from an English-speaking background, there was words that I did not understand. Like, for instance, have you ever got on with someone? I mean, I've repeated this in numerous interviews because I really did not know what that meant, and it was quite embarrassing. And it's just a funny thing that happens.
Okay. So, Chandana, please take over.
Yeah. Chris, in your novel, The Burning Elephant, violence and chaos in a country have been shown as one of the primary triggers for migrating to another country. Of course, there are many other factors too. So, what, according to you, constitutes the concept of a home or a homeland?
Well, again, a very interesting question. Thank you. So far, there's two women that obviously have intrigued me as I began my writing career. One was Olive Pink, and the other one was Indira Gandhi. And the reason why Olive Pink intrigued me was because I lived near her the botanical garden near her, but also she was this white woman that worked with Aboriginal people and was interested in the violence and the massacres that had happened, and so she went to the Northern Territory. And then there was this other woman that really interested me, and that was Indira Gandhi, because of course I was in India in 1984, and there was this incident, and so of course not much spoken about, but I remember the incident, and I remember it because of my parents but I had a very childish memory. I was only 10 years old, and so I didn't quite know what the whole incident meant in regards to but I did research it later on, especially in Alice Springs where I was living, because I'd heard of because I think violence happens both in all countries, and this is part of I didn't want to say life, because it's not, but these things happen, and as writers we are expected to, in a way, be a witness and write about difficult issues. And so so I wanted to explore some of those childhood memories, not just the violence and why people might leave and migrate from one country to another, but also how that may impact on a family.
Okay. Antara, please go ahead.
So, Christopher, my next question, I just wanted to ask about Alice Springs. You were telling about Alice Springs that when you were 28 years old, you shifted to Alice Springs. So, Christopher, can you briefly share with us your journey from Melbourne to Alice Springs, and why did you shift there? Like, why Alice Springs?
Well, I probably won't go that deeply into it, because mainly the bits that I mainly am sharing are bits that I've written about, and bits that I haven't really written about I'm less reluctant to share, because as much as I love talking, ultimately my job is as a writer. So if I write about it one day, I'll share that.
Okay, fine. Okay, Chandana.
Yeah, I'm tempted to ask this as a literature
Sure.
student, that the novel The Burning Elephant opens with the image of an elephant entering a school compound and later on being shot dead and burnt. So why did you choose such a powerful and, if I may say, a bit disturbing image in the first chapter of a novel, which also has Indira Gandhi's assassination as its backdrop?
Yes. So of course, I mean, this was. See, I had written the entire book, and I was wondering how to start it. So I actually wrote the start last. I had that first chapter about the elephant. I wrote that last, but I'd had a draft of everything else, and of course, one could say that the elephant and the shooting of the elephant and the burning of an elephant is a metaphor for things that happened later on, when the prime minister is shot, and then the violence and the riots that occur in the country. But that's one way of looking at it, and that would be a worthy way of looking at it, as a metaphor. Another way that I also thought was an interesting way would be as a totemic symbol. I mean, the elephant represents a major part of India, and so as a totemic symbol, it could be also seen as a catharsis of someone who does leave India. You know, this burning of a totemic, and because I wrote the book in Alice Springs, and I was very conscious of totemic animal and what they represent to the human, and if you kill a totem, you can't kill your own totem, because that can really have bad ill effect on you. And so I thought, you know, when we leave our country, and in a sense we kill our totem, and then we become these new people. So that was another thought. And of course, it's also a bit of a homage to George Orwell, who I you know, as a writer, I read his work and his essay and his piece, particularly as a policeman while he was in Burma, in How to Shoot an Elephant. And I read that quite closely. In fact, my dad made sure I read it, and as a young boy, and I read about George Orwell and How to Shoot an Elephant, and I thought, and that story always stuck in my mind. And instead of the policeman in Burma, the colonial policeman shooting the elephant, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we have a boy witnessing a schoolboy, a 10-year-old schoolboy named Govinda, witnessing an elephant being shot in front of him at his school. And that's how I decided to start the book.
All right, very interesting. And symbols and especially metaphors make it all the more alluring to read.
Thank you.
Antara, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, sir. Christopher, my last question for you today is, like, you have been amidst both Indian and Australian cultures. So share with us two main facets which are very close to your heart among these two cultures or traditions.
Yeah, actually, that's really interesting you should ask that, because I was thinking about that this morning as I was driving. And I was thinking, you know, we often, and I thought you might ask me a question like this, and we often think of Australia as a multicultural place. And it is. I mean, you know, it's an Melbourne, it's a very multicultural place. Australia is a multicultural place. But, you know, one of the other things that I was thinking about was how multicultural India is. And you know, there's this amazing, you know, being brought up in Calcutta amongst Jains, Marwaris, Muslims, Christians, the colonial history, and then going to Bombay or Mumbai in Maharashtra, where my dad is from, and then going to South India, Kerala or Guntikal, where my mother's family, and you know, such a multicultural place with so many different languages and you know, different foods in India. Same could be said about Australia. You know, as you travel around, and especially when you're tapping into the Indigenous side of Australia, where there's, you know, different language groups and yeah, it's very interesting. And there are parallels, a number of parallels, but again, we're going into territory that I haven't written about, so I'd probably stop there.
Fine. No.
Okay. Chris, your novel, your memoir, Into the Suburbs, A Migrant Story, is a much acclaimed novel. And in one of the reviews, I read that it shows us the debilitating effects of racism. So, and you were just 11 when you migrated to Australia. So, would you like to talk about it and share an anecdote with us?
About racism?
Yes.
About racism?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, there are a number of anecdotes about racism, but, you know, these sort of topics like racism and class are often much more subtle, and you know, when you experience these things, sometimes you're not even aware. So, you know, for people, for parents, for instance. So even though I was writing my memoir from the teenage years, one of the things that I would find would be how debilitating it would be for older people, you know, especially as they're trying to fit into the country. And so, you know, sometimes, you know, it's just a challenge. It's such a challenge to uproot yourself and put yourself out there and start your career again. And again, you have to prove yourself. And you could say some of those experiences, especially when people are vulnerable and other people have power over them, maybe that's one of the aspects that where racism can occur. It can also occur in random, situations, especially with people you don't know. So racism is something that creeps up in a way where it can be unexpected, because there's sometimes it can be unexpected where you're just walking down a street, or you can be playing a game and then someone calls you something that was unexpected, a black this or something like that. And sometimes it's unexpected because it's nothing that you've done. And I think people that when it first happens, it's quite a surprise, because sometimes you don't even realize, generally it happens when you least expect it. So that's what's funny about it, because it can catch you unaware.
Okay. I think on that note, we can wind up this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Chris, for so openly sharing your experiences and pouring your heart out. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Antara.
Thank you, TMYS team. Thank you, Chandna and Antara and all your team.
Thank you, Christopher, for being here. Thank you, Chandna. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure to meet you both.
Same here, Christopher.
Pleasure. Thank you.